pals, I'm here today with, I think, appropriate interrogation room lighting to discuss if I achieved my 2020 reading goals and to talk about my plans for my 2021 reading. I apologise for the ridiculously white light. Please, if you make videos and you have a recommendation for a studio light that isn't so fucking bright, then I would love recommendations. The problem is I'm very pale, and I've noticed that when someone takes a photo of me on flash photography, my foundation must have something in it that like just goes woof. I think it's the SPF, so as soon as you put a flash near me I just look like I'm glowing. So there's nothing wrong with me, I just have SPF on, which is reacting to the intense lighting. So I made 3/4 goals in 2020. I'll link the video up here if you feel like going back and watching that video. I look almost exactly the same, like my hair is outgrown, I'm wearing similar makeup. A lot has changed and yet nothing has changed. So you can go and watch that if you fancy it, but I'm going to go through it here so you may as well not bother. The first goal was to try and read more non-fiction, and that is because in 2019 I think I only read about 15 non-fiction books, but around 6 of those made it to my favourite books of the year video, and I think there was only like 10 or 11 books on my favourite books of the year video. So even though I read a tiny amount of non-fiction, a really high percentage of it ended up being in my favourites. So I thought, well, actually I should be reading way more non-fiction if I obviously enjoy it so much. So I didn't give specific numbers because something I'd sort of realised about myself when I did this video last year was that making really specific goals just doesn't work for me as a person. You know, I got on that bandwagon. I've been on BookTube for nearly 8 years now. And it is so much fun to set really specific goals and to be like, okay, each month I want to read 2 of this type of book, 3 of this type of book, and then I want this to be a certain percentage of my reading, and then I want to do this and this. It's loads of fun, but actually, for me as a person, anything that's too specific starts to feel like homework, and I don't want to do it anymore. And I feel like when I overwhelm myself with goals, it's impossible, and each month I felt like I couldn't read by whim anymore because everything became so restrained. So instead I made pretty chilled goals. So I wanted to read more non-fiction, but I don't think I even said in the video what amount I wanted to read. And in the back of my mind I was thinking that I'd be happy to get to about 1/3 of my reading, seeing as the previous year in 2019 probably about 10% of my reading had been non-fiction, and previous to that even I was reading like 1 or 2 non-fiction books a year. So I did manage to get to 29% non-fiction, okay? I read 114 books in 2019 and 33 out of those were non-fiction. So I'm pretty happy with that. You know, I'd rather it was 33% than 29, but like I didn't make this a super specific goal, like I said. And I feel like in coming years I don't really want it to drop below like 1/3. I'd like it to always be between 1/3 and like 50%, and that's where I'll be happy, and I think that'll be really easily achievable for me again in 2021, so I'm not going to make a goal of it. My second goal in 2020 was to try and read more diversely, and I set this as a very like clear thing in my video, in that I said I felt like historically I'd read predominantly books by people like me. So I read lots of books by British authors who are white and who are women, and you know, there's something in that I love, reading books by women of a similar age to me, who grew up around the time I did. I feel a lot of nostalgia from it. But actually I was also reading a lot of books like that were just ending up being 3 stars. And then I was reading lots of books by completely different people from different parts of the world, different races and genders and like sexual orientations and religions and all these things to me, and was getting so much out of them, and was feeling like, as well as really enjoying them, I was learning something from them, which can't always be said for books written by people who are more like yourself. So that was something I wanted to try and do, and I think predominantly I was focusing in on race in 2020 because I knew that was something that I was doing particularly bad at. Not really bad at, but you know, not great, let's be honest. And I also knew that was something that was sort of easier to quantify. You know, there's been discussions about this on BookTube, like people being aware about reading more diversely, but also when you do things like fill out reading spreadsheets or keep track of your reading and you measure things like diversity, sometimes it can get a little bit uncomfortable. You know, if a person doesn't write that in their bio, it's uncomfortable, I think, to try and like assess someone's race or gender identity. So I think you have to tread a fine line. So I guess I went in to 2020 just focusing on trying to read more diversely in general, but really focusing in on race. So out of the 114 books I ended up reading, 52 were by authors of colour, then 2 were anthologies that were by a mixture of authors of colour and white authors, and then the rest were by white authors, which ends up being 46% of my reading by authors of colour. That isn't as good as I would like it to be. So yeah, I think that is, you know, an okay, like, it came out okay, but I would like to do better, so that is something I will still be focusing on in 2021. And then I went into 2020 with 110 unread books on my TBR, like physical books I owned that I hadn't read yet, and that was a pretty low amount for me. In previous years I'd been sitting at around 350, and I had ended up just unhauling so many books, because when I'd had books sitting around for so long, my reading taste had changed, and there was these books I just wasn't interested in anymore and weren't reflective of who I was as a reader today. So the majority of me getting through those books wasn't me being really good at not buying new books, but was me being really brutal with DNFing or unhauling, which I have no regrets about. Like, I never think about any of the books I unhauled and think, oh, I wish I'd have kept that one, so that's completely fine. So I went into 2020 with 110 unread books, and I wanted to try and get that down to 50. So my plan was each month to read or DNF and unhaul 5 books, and then obviously 5 times 12 would have got me down to 50 unread books. Now, this was the one where I think I was going to spectacularly fail, but I turned it around by cheating a little bit. So I wasn't very good at reading physical books for a significant portion of 2020, because as I mentioned to you guys, I was fairly unwell and just couldn't hold physical books, so I was doing a lot of audiobook reading, and I'm sort of against paying for audiobooks when I've already paid for the physical book. So I ended up listening to lots of audiobooks of books I didn't own, so that didn't help me at all with getting through my physical TBR. So sort of from April to October I didn't read all that many physical books, and so, you know, I did read some, but not as many as I usually would, and I even had 1 month or 2 where I only read 6 books each month, which is a lot less than I usually would. So, like, shit happens, everybody had an awful year, and I'm not gonna, like, be really upset about that. But then what happened is when I got to, I don't even know when I did this, a couple of months ago, I really sat down and looked at all the books I still had on my shelves, because I still had about 90 unread books, and I was thinking, I've only got, you know, a few months to go, and I'm not going to get it down to 50 like I wanted. And I really went through them. I read quite a few pages from each of them. I looked at the Goodreads reviews. I spent hours doing this, and really looked at reviews by people I trusted. I looked at the low rated reviews, the high rated reviews, and I unhauled a lot of books, okay? So I currently have 63 unread books on my bookshelf. So I did manage to get it down from 110 to 63, which I'm very happy with. So this is when I want to go into like the breakdown of the 114 books I read and tell you like where they were from, so you can see if I was reading my pre-2020 books, like how many of them I read compared to how many audiobooks and all those sorts of things. Okay, so I read 20 books from my pre-2020 TBR. Isn't great, right? I went in the year with 110, I only read 20 of them. Then I read 47 new to me books, which I feel like is completely fine if I didn't go into the year with so many books I hadn't read already. Like 47 is a completely reasonable amount of books, I think, to acquire in a year for me and to read, but obviously I should have read more books that I'd already owned. I read 19 library books. I mentioned I had sort of 3.5 goals, because the goal I sort of mentioned in my 2020 video was I just wanted to support my library a lot more. I feel like I've done that completely. This year's been a really hard year to support your libraries because they've gone through various stages of being closed or like open but for collection only, but I've still used my library lots. I've only read 19 books from my library, but I've borrowed a lot more than 19, and I don't even know what my like ratio of borrowed and read compared to borrowed and returned unread is, but I've definitely borrowed more books that I've returned unread than I've read, which I'm absolutely fine with. I love that about the library, and a lot of the time I haven't returned them unread because I've become uninterested in them. It's just because I haven't got to them yet and they needed to be returned because someone else had reserved them, so I'll just borrow them at another point. And then I read 29 audiobooks. Like I said, I listened to lots of audiobooks in 2020 because I wasn't feeling well enough to read physical books. I really love my audiobook listening. in 2020. I listened to a lot of audiobooks when I was just like not feeling great and just lying on the sofa, but I also listened to a lot of audiobooks when I was going for walks. So pre-lockdown I have about a 45-minute walk to work and then a 45-minute walk home. But like about half an hour of each of those walks I walk with a friend who I work with, so I don't actually get that much time usually for audiobook listening. But this year with lockdown and with me wanting to still like get in my steps a day, to just mainly not even for exercise but to just get fresh air, good for mental health, I've obviously walked alone a lot more. And so I think the combination of not being able to read physical books and walking by myself a lot more has meant I've managed 29 audiobooks. I'm so happy with that. I really love audiobooks. And even though I am feeling well enough now to read physical books, I still want to ensure I make lots and lots of time for audiobooks because they bring me so much joy. And then I reread 8 books, which were mainly graphic novels to be honest, and a couple of those I did via audio. So if you've been doing the maths, which I'm sure you haven't, that adds up to 123, when I said earlier I only read 114, and that's because there's a few overlaps, right? So sometimes I listen to an audiobook of a book I did already own because I caved and paid for it twice, or sometimes I like listen to a book on audio that was a reread, so there's just a couple of duplicates, but in general it sort of nearly adds up. So what I take from that, out of 114 books, 20 of them were pre-2020 TBR and 8 of them were rereads, so only 28 out of 114 were books that I'd had prior to that year, and the rest were all new to me books, which proves to me that I'm right and that I'm a reader who likes to read books that are like fresh. My taste is much more aligned if I read books quickly after first finding out about them, because I change as a reader. I think a lot of us do, and that is why I still want to aim for a 0 TBR, because I want to be able to be that person who I was before I ever started this channel, where I used to walk into a library and borrow 10 books and get home, and I used to read the first few pages of each one. I used to stack them in order of the one I was most excited about to the one I was least excited about, leave that stack beside my bed and just work my way through, and then go back to the library a couple of weeks later, return them and do it again. Or if I could afford to buy myself some new books, I'd go into Waterstones or Ottakar's as it was at the time. I'd get books usually on like 3 for 2 and I would finish them and then go back. So I never had a stack of unread books until I joined BookTube. And I loved that, and that's, you know, I like having a collection, but I do have a collection. I have a collection of books I've read and loved and kept. I very rarely keep 3-star reads. I only really keep them if they're part of a collection of an author's work who I particularly enjoy. So like nearly all the books I've kept are 4- and 5-star reads. I think it's really representative of who I am as a reader and what I love, and that's the sort of library I personally want to have. So after all of that, I mean, I don't know if the order I'm doing this all in is making sense, but I hope so. I thought what I would talk about now is out of the like unread books I still have, what that's made up of, okay? So as I said, out of my 114 books I had at the start of 2020, I only read 20 of them. I DNF'd 13 of them and I have 38 left, which means I unhauled 39 of them, which is a significant amount to unhaul 39 books. But the vast majority of them are books I'd had since before 2017, and a lot of them were books I'd had from like 2015, 2016. I tried to read them before and thought, I'm not loving that, I'll put it back maybe for another time, and then I'd never felt like reading them again. So I have no regrets, although I have kept a stack of 10 of them, which were sort of newer acquirements to my TBR, and I've put them sort of away in a cupboard, like right at the back. And I figured what I would do is leave them there because they're books I'm almost certain I'm not interested in because I've tried them or seen negative reviews from people I trust, but I still have a tiny bit of interest in them. So I've like pushed them to the back of this like dusty cupboard, and what I thought I would do is come back to them maybe in a year's time, and if I'm completely uninterested in them still, then I'll unhaul them, but until then they're just not counted on my Goodreads unread books, but they're still sort of in the house somewhere, which is cheating a bit, I know, but I make the rules here. So if I hadn't hauled any new books in 2020, I would have been left with a TBR of 38 books, all of which I would have owned for longer than a year. But obviously I did haul books in 2020. Come on, this is me we're talking about. So I worked it out and I hauled 75 books in 2020. Again, I don't think that number is an issue because my aim is to be a person who, like I said, buys books and reads them, or borrows books and reads them. So if you do the maths here, if I bought 75 books, say I had a year where I had 0 books on the shelves when I started, and I bought 75 books and I borrowed 25 and I audiobooked 25, then we'd be at around 125 books, which is, you know, a sort of average I'd like to hit each year, and that would be perfectly reasonable. So that is where I'd like to be at. So I feel fine with it being 75. I will say that out of that 75, I only actually bought 35 of them myself, which again I'm fairly happy with. I worked out in terms of like finances, I think I spent about £350 on books that I paid for, and because, you know, they average sort of £10 each, and I'm completely happy with that. This is something I love and adore, and to have spent £350 on it in a whole year I think is like fine. So 35 I bought, then 23 were gifts from family and friends. I really struggle with that many F's in a sentence, not when it's another type of F. I'm fine with that. And then how many? 17 were sent to me for review from publishers. So I feel like I'm fine with those figures. That's fine. But I thought I would try and figure out of those 75, like what's happened to those books. So I read 47 of them, so I think that's pretty good. Out of 75 to have read 47. I DNF'd 3. Again, that shows to me that having attempted to read 50 of these and only DNFing 3, that means I have a maths 94% hit rate with new books. Obviously I could have given some of those low ratings, I can't be bothered to look into that, but that's pretty good. If I finish a book, it tends to be because it was good enough for me to finish. Every now and again I hate read a book, but that's not that common. I DNF'd in total 37 books in 2020, and only 3 of those were books that I got in 2020. There were, you know, only 3 of those were new to me books. So the rest of them were either library books or pre-2020 books, which again proves to me that I'm just so much more likely to enjoy a book if it's a book that I've picked up recently, because it's much more reflective of who I am as a reader and what I'm interested in. So if I've read 47 of them and DNF'd 3 out of 75, that means I'm left with 25 unread books. So the 63 unread books I have are a combination, like I said, of 25 from 2020, which I haven't read, and 38 from pre-2020, which I haven't read. Fucking hell, if you've stuck with me through all those numbers with no like images to go with them, well done you. Thanks very much. So very quickly, I'm just going to talk about my 2021 goals. Like I said, don't do hardcore goals with like numbers, so this won't take me very long to go through. Firstly, big hitter. I want to read all of those 63 books. Either read them or DNF them. You know, I might end up unhauling a couple, but I shouldn't do because I've gone through it very recently. So I should want to read all of those 63 books. They now fit. I've got all the fiction on a book trolley. It all fits, it's not double stacked. And I've got the few non-fiction just behind me on this shelf here. So yeah, I'm very, very happy. I think it's entirely possible for me to get through those 63 unread books. What is that, like 5 every month with free extra? And I'm planning to read quite a few off my shelves this month because the libraries are closed, so it's a month when it'll be really easy for me to get through my unread books. My second goal is to read more diversely. Whilst yes, I did have this goal last year, I want to think about it much more seriously this year. What I mean by that is, when I look back at the amount of books I read last year by non-white authors, you know, like I said, it's not a 50%, which I'm not happy with. I'd like it to be much more weighted in the favour of authors of colour. But also I recognise that the majority of books I've read by authors of colour fall into a few categories. One of those is black authors, and the others are, I read quite a few books by either Native American authors, First Nations Canadian authors, or Aboriginal Australian authors. And you know, I have a real interest in those voices, and I participated in a couple of readathons in 2020 that really helped me hone in on those voices. But I also don't want to, you know, say to myself, well, if you read this amount of books by non-white authors, it's fine, you haven't got to think about it any more deeply than that, because actually that's not true. I'm aware that something I fall awfully short at is reading books by authors from the Middle East, so please feel free to give me recommendations for that. I'm also aware that I am absolutely fucking horrendous at reading translated books, and that's not for want of trying. I really have tried a lot of translated books over the years, and I do end up DNFing a lot of them. This is something I've always struggled to articulate and talk about in a video, because I don't want to come across as someone who's being really negative about translated books. But I'm just going to be honest here, because I'm hoping that by saying this, people can give me recommendations for translated books that will suit my reading tastes. I find that a lot of books that are translated are either about very serious, depressing topics, which I get because they're translated because they're viewed as being like important in their own country, and a lot of the time books that are viewed as important tend to be about difficult topics. But I also find that a lot of the translated fiction I've tried to read is quite cold and detached, and I don't know if that is just the writing style of some of the countries I've been more focused on. So I guess I've tried to read a lot of books that are translated from Japanese or from Korean, and that could just be more common in publication in those countries, or it could be that that's translation, like that happens when those languages are translated into English. But as a reader, I do struggle with reading books that feel quite cold and detached. I'm someone who really likes lyrical writing, and I found that that's something I struggle to find in translated fiction. I also know that there's a lot of books being translated out of South American countries, which I'm really interested in and would like to read more about, but I also know that my knowledge base about South American politics is absolutely awful, and I find that quite a lot of the books I've tried to read out of those countries that are translated do require some knowledge of the political history of those countries, which I just lack. And so I feel like I lose all the nuances in those stories and don't enjoy them as much as I could. So obviously I need to inform myself more, but also I'd love you guys to give me recommendations for books that you think that are translated that will suit my reading taste more. So I like books that are pretty warm. I'm fine with them being about depressing topics as long as they don't feel overwhelmingly sort of depressing and detached. And I like very lyrical writing rather than very stripped back writing. I'm not someone who likes writing that is like clinical or precise. I like very sort of flowery lyrical writing. So as well as reading more diversely in terms of like author race or nationality, I definitely want to read more diversely in every other way. I know I'm very bad at being aware of disabled authors or neurodivergent authors, or authors who are of different religions to me. I mean, I'm atheist, so of any religion other than my own, or of non-binary authors, trans authors. So there is lots more I could do. I have so many books lined up that I'm really interested in. So again, if you have any recommendations for books that would align to those categories I've just mentioned, please do feel free to recommend them to me. And the third goal is quite a fun one, and it's to read more books that bring me joy. So I read Hollowpox by Jessica Townsend in December, and I realised that I hadn't read any other book in 2020 that was quite so fun and happy and magical. And it made me go back and look at my reading in 2020. And I also thought this because I had recently edited and uploaded my November reading wrap up. Now November, I was doing non-fiction November and Indigathon, and those two categories in my reading taste does mean I'm going to end up reading quite depressing and bleak stories. And I even had a couple of comments of people saying like, God, you read a lot of depressing books, how do you not have that affect you in your mental health? And in general it doesn't, but it did make me realise the combination of editing that video and then reading Hollowpox that I do really miss reading more books that bring me joy. And I think that as a reader of literary fiction and as someone who started to read more non-fiction, and I always read serious, depressing non-fiction, I don't really read like happy light stuff, I sometimes can get tunnel vision with those things and just want to read books like that and sort of forget about the fact that I love fantasy, adult fantasy and middle grade fantasy. I would like to dip my toes more into reading mystery, like cosy mysteries or like slightly literary mysteries. I also would love to try and read more horror. I've hardly read any. I used to love horror as a teenager. I read like so much point horror, I was absolutely obsessed, and I just stopped reading it. I would also really love to focus on sci-fi. You know, I say every year I want to try and give sci-fi a go. You know, I really want to read more sci-fi, and every year I don't. And my excuse has always been, you know, a lot of sci-fi is fast-paced and plot-heavy, and that's not really my bag. But actually, you've given me such great recommendations for more literary sci-fi that you think I'll like, that I have a really great list that I can read from. So I've made a list of sci-fi and fantasy books and mystery books and fantasy middle grade books that I would like to try and read in, or just, you know, a list to pull from. I'm not aiming to read them all in 2021 because there's way too many. But yeah, I just like to read more books that bring me joy, because like I said, I read 114 books in 2020 and I worked out that 1995 of those were pretty serious, heavy topics and sort of slower reads. They weren't easy reads, and so I would just like to bring a little bit more joy into my reading life. And something I want to note here is that for me, I find it much easier to find diverse voices in literary fiction and non-fiction, and I don't think it's anywhere near as easy in fantasy and mystery and all the other genres I just mentioned. So again, if you have recommendations of the genres I just mentioned from diverse voices, I would love to hear them down below. My fourth goal is to participate in the Reading Woman Challenge for 2021. I have never participated in a yearly reading challenge, but this year I saw Jenny over at the channel What's Booking. I'll link her video up here. I really love her channel. She started filming this year during lockdown, I think, and she puts up loads of videos. I really enjoy them, so I highly recommend her channel. She reads a lot of similar books to me, but also does read a bit more genre fiction than me, so I'll be getting some great recommendations from her hopefully during this year. So I saw her do a video where she spoke about all the books she was going to read for each of the challenges, and I thought, God, those challenges sound absolutely brilliant. I'm going to give it a go. So I am going to try and complete them all in 2021. And actually, Lauren from Lauren and the Books and I are planning on doing a live show together quite soon, where we go through the list of prompts and talk about the books we're planning on reading. I'm not quite sure when that's going to be yet, but I'm very much looking forward to doing that and hearing what books she has lined up too. And then lastly, and I do realise that this conflicts somewhat with my goal of reading more books that bring me joy, this goal is to read more books that will educate me. So I've chosen, I think, 4 topics that I would like to focus on in 2021, non-fiction wise, where I think I'm sorely lacking in education and I would like to have much more knowledge and therefore context to apply to the wider world and also my fiction reading. So the first topic I'd like to learn more about is the British Empire. I really loved reading Natives by Carla this year, and it got me thinking much more about how I learned absolutely nothing in school about the British Empire, what we did to many countries around the world, what devastation we caused, and I guess the repercussions of that. And so I want to understand it much more, you know. I don't really completely understand what we mean when we say the Commonwealth. Like, when did we rebrand it and what does that mean compared to the Empire? When did we understand that maybe calling it the Empire was no longer helpful and we should rebrand and make it be called the Commonwealth? You know, all these things, I'd like to just have much more of an understanding about that. So I do have a few books in mind that I think look really good that are talking about this topic, but if you have any recommendations of books you've read and think are really informative about this, or books that you have heard of and think sound really great, then do let me know down below. The second topic is the Troubles in Ireland. Again, learned absolutely fuck all about this in school. I've picked up a tiny bit of information from films and books, but don't really understand an awful lot. And I know some of you might recommend to me now Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. I did actually try and audiobook that last year and gave up on it. It might be a book that I tried to read in physical form. I wasn't sure if I completely gelled with his writing style, but for me it certainly didn't work in audio because there was just too many names, and I don't know, I felt like I was getting more personal information about people than about the Troubles themselves. So yeah, I definitely want to find a couple of books about the Troubles. So I'd love recommendations for this because there's a few books, but I don't know what the right entry point is. I know nothing. So I'd like an entry point that is accessible for someone who knows nothing, but also informative enough that I'm actually going to learn stuff. And then the third topic is the war in Afghanistan. I know so little about it. Like, I was obviously much younger at the time when it all happened, and like Tony Blair and George Bush were complete dickheads and made their little agreement So I would like to understand much more. I know it is like, you know, still has so many repercussions today, and I just don't know enough about it, and that really bothers me because it's happened in my lifetime, so it's certainly something I should know more about. So again, if you have any book recommendations for that, I'd love to know them. And then lastly, this is a much broader topic and I may need to narrow this down a bit, but as I said earlier when I was talking about wanting to read more translated fiction, my knowledge of South American politics and history in particular is almost zero, and again, what I've picked up from films and novels, so that's not good enough. And so I may need to hone in on maybe a certain country. Like, let me know if you have more knowledge about this topic than I do, perhaps if you do live in South America or if you've studied a lot of South American history. Do you think I should focus in on one country or a group of countries, or is it possible to pick up books on the whole continent and their history and politics? Probably not, because I would like to be able to read more translated books out of South American countries, but right now my knowledge is just not good enough to get the wider context of a lot of those books and to pick up on the nuances. So again, I would love recommendations for books about South American history and politics. So those are 4 pretty heavy topics, which doesn't really align with my aim to read more joyful books, but I do want to read lots of non-fiction. So some of my non-fiction can focus on these topics, and I don't want to quantify this and say, you know, you need to read X amount of books for each topic. I will just start them, and if I feel like one has given me enough knowledge for like this year, then I'll stop. And if I read another and think, oh, I need to learn more, or I want to, you know, go more down this rabbit hole with this thing, then I'll read more. So it's just that I would like to read at least one book on each of these 4 topics in 2021. So I hope you enjoyed this video. As I said, I'd love recommendations for all the topics I've mentioned. I really, really appreciate it. I love having more books to add to my TBR, and I just can't possibly know about all the books out there. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what your goals are. If you have any crossover with me in terms of goals, that'd be really interesting. And do let me know if you'd like to know any more info about any of these goals, and I can perhaps do like further videos talking more explicitly about them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!